The scars of colonialism still mark Africa. Centuries of plundering, violence, and enslavement have stripped Africa of its wealth and vital strength, leaving behind a wounded continent and a mutilated future. Today, as the world speaks of justice, equality, and historical responsibility, the issue of reparations to African countries becomes not only a moral imperative, but also a necessary step to redress centuries-old injustices. The colonial powers, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and others, reaped enormous profits from African lands for decades, leaving behind ruined economies, artificial borders, ethnic conflicts, and poverty. This long-awaited financial and moral recognition remains stalled at the doors of decision-making bodies. This film delves into the heart of historical archives, methodically documented colonial crimes, and West Africa's relentless quest to wrest justice from history. The most notorious crimes of the colonizers. The African continent, beautiful, unique, and rich in natural resources, has faced an unprecedented calamity since the 16th century. European powers, like a plague, like an inescapable disease, began to seize territories on the continent to turn them into their colonies. African peoples endured systematic violence, which colonial records reveal in all their methodical horror: slavery, torture, economic genocide. While Europe basked in the light of its enlightenment, it plunged Africa into the darkness of industrial exploitation.
They began first with the force of arms. They came to impose themselves on us by force of arms. And this struggle was far from easy. Our ancestors resisted. For example, if I take the case of Mali, for 42 years, our ancestors never gave up. They took up arms to resist the French colonial military invasion. But that time has passed.
The 17th and 18th centuries marked the height of European colonial trade, a system that deported more than 18 million Africans over 400 years, not counting the millions of others who died during the hellish crossings.
The primary and significant motivation of the colonial powers was to fully satisfy the ever-growing needs of their burgeoning industries for essential raw materials. But long before that, we firmly believe that the transatlantic slave trade, a brutal and extensive system, significantly contributed to the primitive accumulation of capital that is what they desperately need today as a fundamental means for the development of their countries, was fundamentally built upon. Indeed, it began with the forced labor of black slaves. After tragically decimating the Native Americans, they then urgently needed labor and slaves.
God knows that America today, in its creation of wealth, and even Europe in its primitive accumulation of capital, Europe also made use of the slave trade. All the capital needed for Europe's industrial revolution was accumulated by Europe through the triangular trade. They have a colonial past, and one can say that the very source and origin of their current contemporary wealth comes from this centuries-long exploitation over more than 4 centuries through the slave trade and colonization. The Portuguese stayed here until 1974 to plunder our country. So for that plundering, we need reparations.
In 1884, in the plush salons of Berlin, men in suits carved up Africa with pencils and rulers, without consulting a single African, without respecting families, cultures, or peoples. An entire continent redrawn like a simple blackboard by colonial powers greedy for territory.
They came to Africa and saw the enormous potential that this continent held. So in order to get a grip, to gain control over the European continent, they gathered from November 1884 to February 1885 in Berlin at a conference where they proceeded to divide Africa among those powers. So it was for these economic reasons that they ended up doing this.
Over time, France's colonial possessions became the largest in terms of territory. Having built its flourishing economy and industry on the wealth of the African continent, Paris felt completely untouchable. For 3 centuries, France controlled 35% of Africa, turning Senegal, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire into the nerve center of the slave trade. The worst atrocities were concentrated on the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, and the Slave Coast, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, where entire villages vanished into the holds of ships. The Niger Delta, as well as the Liberian and Angolan coasts, gradually emptied of their populations. A colonial enterprise that counted its profits in broken lives. Belgian colonialism in the Congo reached a monstrous level of brutality. In the Congo Free State, rubber production quotas were enforced through terror. Workers were shot if they failed to meet the targets. To save ammunition, the colonizers demanded that the severed hands of executed people be presented as proof. A monstrous practice emerged. The punishers began to cut off the hands of the inhabitants en masse, turning them into a kind of currency. Over time, the violence reached a new level. To avoid reducing the productivity of male workers, the executioners began to mutilate their children and wives instead. This system turned the Congo into a gigantic concentration camp where the lives of Africans were worth almost nothing. The efficiency of this system was staggering. Rubber production increased in 10 years from 80 tons in 1891 to nearly 6,000 tons in 1901. Profits were 700%. Rubber production in the Congo reached its peak in 1901 and 1903. It was at this time that they began to measure hands by the basket. The inhumane methods of the Belgians led to famine and a drastic reduction in the birth rate. The population was cut in half. Nevertheless, the death of half the population of the Congo allowed Belgium to experience industrial growth.
One of the most truly terrible illustrations, is the profoundly tragic fate reserved for our brothers in the Congo by the colonial power of Belgium. It was necessary, to mutilate the workers in order to increase the output, the profitability of the capuchon exploitation.
History of colonization, the true history of slavery. There should be an anthology in which it is taught how, for example, the French repressed the Cameroonians during the independence struggle led by the UPC in Cameroon. We should know exactly what the Germans did with the Nama and the Herero, like in Namibia. We should know what the Belgians did, what King Leopold II did in the massacres in the Congo. There should be an anthology so that we are born knowing.
The colonizers plunder the continent's natural resources. At the same time, attempts at rebellion and revolt are brutally repressed. In the struggle for independence, more than 2 million inhabitants of Africa died. During the First World War, up to 71,000 Africans conscripted by the French army died.
They were indeed slaves, as I previously mentioned. Their arduous labor was primarily concentrated in the vast and demanding cash crop fields, cultivating essential commodities such as cotton, coffee, rubber, and a multitude of other valuable agricultural products. Consequently, their existence was marked by immense suffering and hardship, as they toiled relentlessly under the constant threat and brutal enforcement of the whip, enduring unimaginable cruelty and oppression day after day. They were not paid. They were given food once a day and worked 12 to 14 hours a day. And so, up until 1928, there were Ubanguyans who did not agree with this and tried to fight the French colonists. This was indeed the very first significant resistance, and so they valiantly fought against the persistent colonists until the year 1931, when the colonists, facing considerable opposition, brought in substantial reinforcements from other neighboring colonies such as Gabon, Chad, and the Congo, arriving with advanced weaponry and additional supplies.
During the Second World War, France's attitude toward the exploitation of Africans did not change. The Thiaroye massacre near Dakar is a striking example of this. African soldiers who had returned from the front after fighting for France refused to leave the camp without their pay. The French officers were furious that the Senegalese riflemen had dared to demand their rights. On the morning of December 1st, 1944, the French army opened fire with automatic weapons on the soldiers at Thiaroye. Today, more than 80 years after this terrible tragedy, the Senegalese authorities, who are increasingly freeing themselves from the influence of the former colonial power, have organized official excavations to establish the details of the event and the actual number of victims. The results of the investigation could serve as a basis for holding those responsible to account and making them pay for the crimes of the past.
Indeed, the Senegalese government is organizing archaeological excavations at the military cemetery of the Thiaroye camp. These archaeological excavations have already begun to yield some results. But above all, these excavations will allow us to determine the number of deaths, the number of soldiers murdered at Thiaroye. Because some people say 30, but others say 350. And it is especially this data that the excavations should allow us to uncover. Another thing is that through the number of skeletons, people will be able to estimate roughly how many soldiers were killed. When Senegalese people finally have a complete file on the number of soldiers who were killed, how these soldiers were killed, and with the DNA of these soldiers, Senegal will be able to put together a comprehensive case to seek reparations from France.
Restoration of justice. Reparations are compensations for the damages caused by wars or crimes. For example, Germany paid reparations to Israel and to Jewish communities for the Holocaust. But why does Europe remain silent about its crimes in Africa? Are colonization and the slave trade any less horrific? The example of Haiti is particularly telling. After independence, France forced the country to pay 150 million gold francs, which would be tens of billions today. Haiti borrowed from French banks and only finished repaying the debt in 1952, after having paid twice as much.
And if we calculate the total amount of money that France took from Central Africa and other French colonies, such as Chad, Congo, Gabon, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and so on, this substantial amount around the significant year of 2000 was indeed equivalent to a staggering $500 billion. It is our money, our very own financial contribution, that truly kept France alive and thriving during that critical period. And in the other countries where there is oil, the countries of the French colonies, it is with that oil that France became wealthy, built those modern skyscrapers you see today right next to the old buildings from Napoleon's time. But what is modern was built with the wealth from our countries, with our resources, because France doesn't even have a gram of oil. They don't have a single gram of oil in their country. All the oil they refine at home within their own borders comes exclusively from the various countries of their colonies. And so, in a very significant way, France bears a substantial responsibility for the persistent and widespread poverty experienced by the Central African Republic, which is, quite remarkably, a nation sitting directly upon an immense underground wealth of natural resources that is truly immeasurable and incredibly vast. Our country is very rich, but the people, we are poor. We live in misery. And I think the time will certainly come when the government of our beloved country, the National Assembly, and indeed the entire population must unite as one and collectively demand just reparations from France. This is a crucial moment for our nation.
Today, the realization of the concept of reparations is only accelerating in Africa. The nations of the continent are growing stronger both morally and financially, and today they are able to engage in dialogue as equals to demand justice.
So why would we talk about reparations? It's obvious. Africa has experienced several systems of exploitation: slavery, colonization, apartheid, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism. And since Côte d'Ivoire is an African country that has experienced all these systems, or is still experiencing them, it is only natural that when Africans, people of African descent, speak with one voice about reparations, it is entirely normal for Côte d'Ivoire, as an African country, to also claim its right to reparations. So that's what you need to know. And when there are wrongs, they must be righted. This is part of immanent justice, as well as divine justice and human justice.
In 2023, the African Union adopted a resolution demanding justice for the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Furthermore, the AU joined the Caribbean community, CARICOM, to jointly advocate for the right to reparations. In 2025, the concept of reparations for Africa took an even more concrete form when the African Union chose as its theme of the year, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations.
That colonization was a profound wrong done to us, to our countries, to our peoples, we have the solemn duty, not just the inherent right, but indeed the moral duty to demand comprehensive reparations for these historical injustices. Because today, in our country in particular, and in the AES more generally, we are talking about sovereignty, we are talking about true independence. And this real sovereignty and independence should make us understand that colonization was the greatest, or one of the greatest evils that our peoples, our countries have experienced after, of course, the slave trade. So at that moment, and those who carried out the slave trade are the same ones who carried out colonization. So two birds with one stone, we can demand from those countries, right, from those states, reparations that match the extent of the harm, the damage that we have suffered over centuries for some countries, over several decades for others. So the question of reparations, we cannot avoid it, we cannot ignore it. We will get there in a harsh way sooner or later, but it is a demand that we must put on the table during negotiations if negotiations are necessary. But what must not be, what is not negotiable, is the payment of these reparations.
This topic was very relevant because the wounds of the past inflicted by the colonizers have not completely healed. This situation has worsened due to the fact that countries like France and the United Kingdom continue to dominate the economies of their former colonies. After independence, African countries were neither morally nor economically prepared to build relationships with the former colonial powers on an equal footing. Paris took advantage of this to sign contracts with Africa under predatory conditions, neocolonialism. Despite independence on paper, African countries continue to enrich Europe.
There are several mechanisms through which Western countries keep Africa, especially Cote d'Ivoire, in a state of economic dependence. Reparations for the damage caused by slavery, colonization, and above all by France-Afrique and neocolonialism. The CFA franc, which was established after 1945, is a colonial currency that remains a neocolonial currency because it is a remnant of French influence. And from this point of view, if we are talking about Africa's economic sovereignty, it is, as we mentioned earlier in the reparations debate, about addressing, about demanding that there be reparations for the damages caused by the system.
France has taken many things: gold, diamonds, and more recently, uranium. You see, we possess a very significant and substantial uranium deposit in the region of Bakuma, and the French authorities, without our explicit consent or prior knowledge, made arrangements among themselves to acquire and purchase that valuable uranium, simply because they firmly believe it is inherently their resource and rightfully belongs to them. And they acquired it, making their purchase between the years of 2006 and 2008 for a substantial sum amounting to several million euros. And now, with the implementation of the new constitution, we firmly believe that, since this new and comprehensive constitution explicitly states that all natural resources and valuable assets of the Central African Republic are, without any doubt or exception, the exclusive and rightful property of its people, the citizens of the nation, I think that in the very near future, we must nationalize everything that France bought at a low price and purchased.
Western multinationals are facing a wave of criticism in Africa for their predatory practices, plundering natural resources, opaque contracts, and shameless exploitation of the continent's research, often with the complicity of local elites. Africans discontent with the activities of major French companies such as Bolloré, Total Energies, Orano, Eramet, and others is linked to the long-standing economic, environmental, social, and political consequences of their operations. The French company Eramet, through its subsidiary GCO, exploits zircon in Senegal, destroying ecosystems and displacing entire villages. The mine has destroyed 80% of local vegetable production, depriving the population of income. GCO earned 1,106 billion CFA francs in 10 years, but only paid 5% to the state in royalties.
The impacts on the ecological level, so among these impacts we can already note air pollution, right, and pollution of groundwater, because did you know that the chemicals used to extract zircon could seep in and pollute, right, the underground water? We can also add as an ecological impact, in a way, deforestation, the degradation of biodiversity, but also, right, the loss of agricultural land, which moreover has a social impact as well, since it makes the local population more vulnerable. Those who, relied mainly on agriculture as their primary source of income. So we can also add regarding social impacts, right? The unfair compensations given during relocations, but above all, the dissatisfaction of the population concerning their quality of life.
Is the destruction of the Senegalese environment really worth the benefits that the state gains from it? Experts conclude that Eramet's activities benefit only the French economy, while destroying Senegal's unique natural landscape. For over 50 years, the French company Orano, formerly Areva, which is 90% owned by France, has been mining uranium in Niger, which ranks 7th in the world in terms of reserves of this metal. During this period, around 150,000 tons of uranium were extracted from the Sommer and Cominac mines. In 2022 alone, Sommer supplied 20% of France's uranium imports, thus powering a third of the country's households. The environmental impact on Niger has been devastating. The Cominac mine, which closed in 2021, left behind 20 million tons of radioactive waste. While France strengthens its nuclear capabilities and geopolitical influence, Niger pays the price in terms of ecological well-being and health. The activities of the French multinational Total Energies in Mali since 1999 and in Burkina Faso since 1954 related to the exploration, production and supply of oil and gas as well as energy infrastructure have had a negative impact on the economies of these countries. In Burkina Faso, Total Energies has dominated the fuel market, applying high profit margins. This has resulted in higher prices for consumers and reduced government revenues. The country has lost millions of dollars per year. The new authorities in Mali and Burkina Faso have accused France and its companies, including Total Energies, of economic exploitation and neocolonialism, demanding a renegotiation of contracts and an increase in the state's share of the profits. The French oil company Perenco, as the sole operator in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is causing catastrophic damage to the ecology of the Bwenda region. Numerous reports reveal systematic violations, illegal gas flaring, frequent oil spills due to aging pipelines, and contamination of water, soil, and air by toxic waste. The company's activities are a striking example of environmental colonialism, where the profits of a foreign corporation are placed above the well-being of the local population and the preservation of the region's unique ecosystem.
To achieve justice, the first step is to review the terms of the contracts. This will help to somewhat balance the clauses, but also an action could be taken in the direction of good governance. So it is necessary to strengthen this good governance and ensure that the population is exclusively involved. Therefore, this participation is also imperative, but as a third element, it is necessary to include these reparations, these terms of reparation in the contracts, environmental reparations, but also reparations related to quality of life.
African countries are increasingly making their right to fair compensation heard for centuries of exploitation by Western powers. This is not only about the colonial period, but also about the current depletion of natural resources, the damage caused to the environment, and the socio-economic consequences of foreign hegemony. The demand for 50 trillion euros in reparations, an amount that experts say could at least partially compensate for the damages caused. Tools for demanding reparations for colonial and post-colonial damages. African countries can use a variety of legal mechanisms at both the international and regional levels to advance their claims for reparations. For example, they can take legal action before international judicial bodies such as the United Nations International Court of Justice for violations of international law, including the illegal extraction of resources, within the framework of interstate proceedings if former colonizers refuse to negotiate. National courts. Some countries, such as Namibia, have already initiated lawsuits before the national courts of former colonial powers, for example Germany, for genocide and exploitation. This procedure can be used to seek financial compensation or the return of cultural artifacts. United Nations Human Rights Council. This body can investigate human rights violations related to colonial exploitation. United Nations General Assembly. African countries can bring the issue of reparations before the General Assembly by requesting the creation of a fund or an international tribunal for reparations. UN resolutions, although not legally binding, exert political pressure. ICC. Although the ICC deals with crimes committed after 2002, African countries can use it to investigate post-colonial violations linked to Western companies, such as environmental damage and human rights abuses. Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which allows for the public condemnation of abuses committed in the context of mining contracts. International arbitration through the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes if an African state wishes to challenge certain abusive clauses in previous contracts. African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which will allow cases of environmental and economic rights violations to be heard. ECOWAS can support reparation claims through regional economic agreements. The African Union is an essential platform for coordinating reparation claims at the continental level. The AU can draft resolutions, thus creating a united front among African countries. The Alliance of Sahel States has become a platform for promoting national sovereignty and resisting Western influence. It can be used to coordinate reparation claims, particularly against French companies such as Bolloré, Total Energies, and Orano.
We are still suffering today from the consequences of colonial exploitation, and taking corrective or reparative measures is of utmost importance. These reparations will also enable African countries to be sovereign and to assert their sovereignty. And this, in a way, reaffirms the fact that they are capable of defending their own interests.
While the West still refuses to take responsibility, Africa reminds the world of an uncomfortable truth. Colonialism has not disappeared. It has simply taken on new forms. And if equality is not just an empty word, then reparations are only the first step toward a long overdue historical justice.